I'm Gretchen Marie Schaefer. I'm the director of REMCAD's Visiting Artist, Scholar, and Designer program. The VASD program is an interdisciplinary initiative that values passionate curiosity and explores critical, diverse, and creative inquiry through a variety of events and presentations. We are very honored to further enrich the academic experience for all of our students here at the college and to serve the greater Denver metro community. Tonight, we are very excited to be presenting the second artist talk in the VASD program's year-long pattern series, which explores the multifaceted and dynamic nature of repetition in contemporary art and culture. From DNA to data, from ornamentation to textiles, from history to habits, the universe is full of order derived from chaos. And as life becomes increasingly complicated, the power of predictable groupings and regimented, simple narratives grows increasingly alluring. Patterned organization can provide solace in the complex world and can even crystallize a sense of divine perfection. But it can also reduce and simplify to a point of dangerous inaccuracy, eliciting false positives and misjudging correlation for causation. Through next April, the series will explore the human desire for symmetry, categorization, and repetitive alignment at a time when social and political progress simultaneously aims for a more nuanced and intersectional perspective. When I saw tonight's speaker, Melissa Thorne's beautiful work at the MCA Denver earlier this year, I knew she was a perfect fit for this series. I've come to learn that for over 2 decades, Melissa has used the language as pattern as a cultural indicator of history and identity, often exploring issues of gender and class in her work. In paintings that reference handmade textiles, instructional diagrams, and DIY architecture, she inserts a feminist voice in a revisionist history of geometric abstraction. Over the past 10 years, her interest in architecture and geographic place has led her to create site-specific works in diverse venues, including galleries and museums, artist-run storefronts, public spaces, and abandoned cabins. In her pattern series artist talk this evening, Melissa will discuss her research as it examines the role that pattern plays in reshaping our understanding of the sublime and the experiential. Melissa is currently working and living in upstate New York. She received her BFA from Carnegie Mellon University and her MFA from the California Institute of Arts. Her work has been featured at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver, as I mentioned, and the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, among many others. She's received residencies at the Bemis Center for Contemporary Art, the core program at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the U-Cross Foundation, and the Santa Fe Art Institute, as well as a fellowship in painting from the New York Foundation for the Arts. Melissa teaches as an assistant professor at the University at Albany, SUNY, and we are absolutely thrilled to have her with us tonight. Please welcome Melissa Thorne.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm so pleased to be here, and thank you all for being here too. I especially want to thank Gretchen Schaefer and the Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design for inviting me to speak about one of my favorite topics, pattern. I'm going to talk about this complex topic through the lens of my own work and process, with some occasional detours into the art and writing of others. I'll make some general comments about the ideas and material in my work, and then I'll go into a bit more depth about particular projects. My work challenges the notion of pattern as a purely decorative device. Instead, I see pattern as a tool for making paintings that relate to domestic interiors, vernacular architecture and craft, and paintings that are concerned with expanding notions of class, feminine subjectivity, and agency. Early in my development, these interests were manifested in portable paintings referencing, as Gretchen said, handmade textiles, instructional literature, DIY architecture, At the time, I wanted to make works that paid homage both to the history of abstract painting and to the history of anonymous crafters. The common thread through much of this work was its referential relationship to domestic architecture, using visual cues from both structure and surface. Over the past decade, my practice has expanded to include installation formats and site-specific wall paintings. In each instance, I've tried to complicate the neutral reading, I say neutral, reading of interior architecture with patterned interventions that relate directly to the site. Specifically, I'm interested in painting's ability to create interruptions in our sensory experience of architecture. Increasingly, I'm drawn to unconventional sites for creating and showing new work that addresses our relationship to built spaces. The common formal connection in all of this work is the perceptual and conceptual possibility of pattern. Through principles of repetition and variation, pattern provides a dynamic optical experience while simultaneously delivering referential information about culture, history, gender, among an array of contextual frameworks. I'd like to begin my talk by describing how I arrived at this engagement and how it relates to my early understanding of abstract painting. And I'll be coming back to some of these images. Since I'm speaking at an art school, I'm going to refer to my last experience as a student. In the late 1990s, I moved from Brooklyn to Southern California to attend CalArts for graduate school. I had been making small paintings on paper and wax panels featuring meticulously rendered images of embroidery diagrams. My mentor at the time was a modernist art historian, and I was reading a lot about minimalist artists. I was drawn to the work of Agnes Martin, who rejected the drama of abstract expressionism in favor of a methodically repetitive process. Rather than show an illusionistic window onto a world, or orchestrate a compositional gesture, Martin's paintings remained resolutely tied to the surface and faced back out at me, almost as an opposing force. I was looking for a different kind of expression than I had seen before, and I thought that there was something fiercely expressive about her methodical, rigorous use of repetitive pattern. I was also reading the writing of Donald Judd, who believed that art should not be a representation, but rather should exist on its own as a presence to be encountered by the viewer. This idea appealed to me because I wanted to make paintings that weren't compositional pictures. I didn't want to make illusionistic spaces or representations. I wanted to make a surface that might have the sensory presence that Judd wrote about. Judd also wrote about the effect of work as it was encountered in space and changed by location, light, or relative scale. This intrigued me because I was thinking about the portability of painting and how it might be read in different situations. At the same time, I was working as an intern for Grandma Prisby's Bottle Village, a folk art site in Simi Valley, California, a collection of 16 buildings made of bottles and mortar, all built by Tressa Prisby to house her collection of 10,000 pencils, 600 dolls, among many other things. In her determination and repetitive building process, I saw a parallel to Agnes Martin's process, in this case using the recognizable scraps of daily life rather than paint. I also saw a parallel to Judd's concept of seeing a work on site, that the viewer's experience would be formed by specific conditions. In this case, we see the exterior view of the bottle wall and then the sort of stained glass effect produced when you're immersed in the interior. This reminded me of Judd's work, in which a simple form could be built but then acted upon by site conditions to produce a new effect. I was trying to put together what seemed like disparate influences. On the one hand, a minimalist ethos for form and presence, and on the other hand, the blatantly narrative inclusion of personal history and memory via the discarded objects of culture. I was probably also trying to reconcile my own small-town upbringing with the new art discourse I was discovering. How could I make space for myself, my family, and my friends within this contemplative framework? I wanted to make paintings that functioned as minimalist objects, but were made more accessible through the direct inclusion of recognizable reference. And these are images that I made when I was still a student at that time. Paintings that hung not singly, but in these sort of grouped arrangements. I was making paintings using a language of abstraction, grids, stripes, modular repetition, but each painting was in fact derived from a personal object. This was the beginning of a way of working, a method that I eventually called documentary abstraction. Using an inherently paradoxical framework, I wanted to make paintings that included the contemplative space and visual buzz of geometric abstraction, but that refused to relinquish their crafty origins. And when I use the term documentary abstraction, I'm referring to the method in which these paintings were made. So each painting was made in reaction to a specific object. So the middle painting that has this kind of zigzag pattern was made the exact same size and the exact same colors and the exact same sort of schematic as the Afghan that it was based on. So I was sort of trying to play with this idea of a one-to-one kind of document. This was meant to be somewhat humorous. I felt that I was poking fun at the solemnity of art history by infusing its structures with imagery from the domestic interior, a domain that had been relegated to second-class status in comparison to the aesthetic dialogue of the art world. And even within the recognized craft world, there was a hierarchy of domestic crafts that received attention. For instance, Amish quilts or Shaker textiles were valorized for their restrained design, but crocheted Afghans and needle-pointed potholders were not. I bring up this distinction to emphasize that I did and do think of these paintings as having feminist intention, since they drew attention to creative labor that would be primarily associated with women. However, I would propose that this work was equally focused on issues of class, selecting images and objects for attention that were aesthetically marginalized, discarded in thrift stores, or specifically used to denote lower class status or perhaps poor taste. I thought that by rescuing these objects and painting them in a purposefully meticulous, devotional attitude, that I was valorizing them. So at this point, I want to interrupt my own images with a slight pause to talk about the way that I was using pattern in these pieces and how my own research impacted my choices. I knew about the work of pattern and decoration artists like Miriam Shapiro above and Joyce Kozlov below, and I knew that what I was doing was tied to their work, partly in reaction to the reductive and exclusive strategies of minimalism that they had reacted to. And I was very aware of the work of West Coast artists like Jim Iserman, using pattern and decoration to create a bridge with the language of design and the domestic space. All of these artists used the backdrop of art history as a foil, making space for new voices by including gendered or seemingly lowbrow visual elements in their work, placing value on decorative pattern that had been devalued through reproduction. It's doing it again. Oh no, it's not. Okay, sorry. I'm doing it again. Placing value on decorative pattern that had been devalued through reproduction and the rise of kitsch. The devalued idea of decorative pattern as kitsch is complicated, but it's due in part, in general, to the Industrial Revolution. While meticulously crafted decoration once signified a devotional attitude or pride in artisanal virtuosity, the mechanized facsimile of this surface seemed to signify inauthenticity, a faked labor in favor of the appearance of luxury. On the left, this is a piece of 16th century Italian handmade lace, and on the right, machine-made contemporary Italian lace, which is made by the yard. Combined with other social factors, these ideas seeped into the mainstream consciousness in the 20th century, leading to a hierarchical preference for austere, streamlined design and the designation of overly patterned or embellished surfaces as garish, false, or suspect in taste. Wondering if the handmade still carried an aura of intentionality, I adopted not just the image of specifically handmade crafts, but also the principle of frame and fill. As a phrase, frame and fill, as a way to compose my paintings. This is a term that I borrow from Ernst Gombrich's fascinating text, The Sense of Order. In the lacework on the left, the crafter has placed a symmetrical design, or has planned a symmetrical design ahead of time, delineating the boundaries of the finite piece and then filling with ornament, in this case to glorify the central figure, which is St. Augustine. I purposefully chose this bounded way of working to see if I could translate flat pattern into painted presence. I didn't want the feeling of disposable yardage or an undifferentiated field. Instead, I was trying to figure out a way to call up the intentional presence of the original crafter, or perhaps to resuscitate the documented object as a sort of animated presence. By delineating a boundary for decorative pattern, I hoped that I was featuring the embodied object in the manner, for instance, that one might paint a portrait. So moving forward, this is another painting from the same period in which I began making paintings based on crocheted Afghans made with gradated yarn. This is yarn that gradually shifts in color. I'm sure some of you have seen this. And I inadvertently stumbled on a sort of pixelating effect that occurs when complex patterns are sometimes flattened. So around this time, I started to become a more discerning collector of my visual materials, and I started to treat my Afghans, pot holders, doilies, and pillows as a kind of pattern archive. This is an image of my studio from that time. Or like a visual library of formal cues. And I'll quickly run through a few more paintings from this time period. I continue the documentation of each Afghan with this very kind of painstaking attention to size, color, and stitch. And I made smaller paintings based on crocheted needlepoint pillows, God's eyes, and doilies. And I became increasingly interested in the unexpected optical effects produced by flattening an image. For instance, the crocheted Afghan may not have any quality of optical illusion, but its flattened painting twin could have movement or vibration. At this point, I was beginning to feel some fatigue in the process of my work, and I saw that without some shift, I could easily continue to make similar paintings indefinitely. I wanted to reconsider my sources and my material methods, and at this time, I received a summer residency at the UCross Foundation in Wyoming, and I spent the majority of my time there teaching myself how to make watercolors. When I came back to Los Angeles, I worked with this new material on a more portable scale, creating images of both domestic craft patterns, as I sort of had been doing, as well as patterns from architecture. I was starting to connect the inside and the outside of space and thinking more about the way works speak to each other to build new meaning. So this is 24 watercolors that are not terribly large in scale. I think each one is about 11 by 14. But they're only seen together as one piece. They don't exist as singular pieces. They're meant to speak to each other and have a kind of cross-pollinating effect. This is an image of my studio at that time, and I was also just starting to experiment with watercolor and ink on a larger scale, in this case expanding a needlepoint pattern to cover one of the walls of my studio. Shortly after, I received another residency at the Santa Fe Art Institute. My increasing interest in experimental domestic architecture had led me to the work of Michael Reynolds, who founded the community called Earthship Biotexture near Taos, New Mexico. This is a community of dozens of homes, all constructed using the principle of waste recycling, using car tires and cement as initial building foundations. All the homes are off the grid and use solar power and wind energy and water recycling. And I used my residency at the Santa Fe Art Institute as a home base and became a sort of informal artist in residence at the biotexture site, taking photos, making drawings, and occasionally helping in building projects. Being on site, being outside of the studio, and thinking about the relationship of the exterior built form to the specific sense of place in the New Mexico high desert were important byproducts of this residency. This is a photo of a pattern made on one of the roofs of one of the structures. It's all recycled metal cut out of old washers and dryers. But an equally important byproduct of this residency was my visit to the Georgia O'Keeffe Research Center, where I came in contact with her system of preserving color palettes for paintings. These are drawers that you can pull out at the Georgia O'Keeffe Research Center. I'm sure some of you have probably been there. It's an amazing place. And they have these sort of color chips that she had made that are keyed up to the paintings that they correspond to, so you can sort of see her color decision process. I was looking for a new way to use color in my work, and my past paintings had used the principle of documenting the color in these found objects, or sometimes referencing color for vintage photos as a way to signal a historical period. So I extended this frame of reference to cover a wider range of surfaces and elements. I began a practice that I still use now of gathering materials from a place and making a palette on site. This was partly influenced by the unique quality of the light in Santa Fe and Taos, which I thought was a particularly crystalline, clear, cold light that I knew I couldn't reproduce once I went back home. By making the palette on site, I hoped to preserve the particular color I was seeing and then use it in paintings that might reference a sense of location. So these are a couple of the watercolor paintings that I was making from that time, which are a little larger in scale. These are around 30 by 40. In some ways, this was a pretty major shift in my work. I had moved from painting the interior object to painting exterior structure, and now I was also thinking about this idea of denoting a sense of place through landscape or color. But the main connector through this process was, again, pattern. I retained a focus on the modularity and repetition of pattern as an ordering principle for myself, and as a communicative tool to guide a viewer back toward the contemplative space of abstract painting. During this process, my gaze had turned outward, and when I returned to Los Angeles, I began observing my surroundings in a much more purposeful way. In the past, I had looked at interior objects or books, but now I started reading my environment more carefully. Perhaps it's a cliche, but in Los Angeles, I did a lot of driving. As I commuted to teaching or to my studio, I found myself looking more carefully at the range of patterning that was used to decorate freeway retaining walls. A predominant pattern was rubble stone, which refers to a type of masonry that uses irregular stones and offcuts. Older retaining walls often were built using actual stones, while newer walls used material like recycled concrete or molded concrete pattern to look like stone. This is an image from the 110 freeway, very close to downtown Los Angeles, and I became sort of a connoisseur of like these different patterns on the walls, and this particular image I became a little bit obsessed with because it appears to be a pattern, but in fact isn't. It's an original composition. There is no repeater in this pattern. So I began to think about who the original composer was of this freeway wall and thought that they had had a really good time putting it together. On the exits and off-ramps near this particular cement patch, there were also a series of short retaining walls that use a similar method, I think just by using cuts of 2x2 lumber to create a mold that would then sort of look roughly like a geometric abstracted stone pattern. But there was also a painterly aspect to these walls. Layers of graffiti had been covered by multiple tints of different gray primer, which produced a really curious palette of muted colors, and then sometimes a few colors of sort of spray painted graffiti. Similar to my experience in Santa Fe, I began to catalog the colors I found, often chipping small flakes off of paint off of the walls and bringing them back to my studio for color matching. And this is my version of the Georgia O'Keeffe palette image. I was using the found color from the site, which you can see up at the top, and then composing an abstraction based on the rock wall pattern, bringing the two together to see if the combination might produce something of the feeling or sensibility of the original. And these are a few more from this series. They're all fairly small, kind of cut paint and paper constructions, maybe a little larger than the other watercolors in the range of maybe 18 by 15. While my earlier paintings of the crocheted and needlework objects use the idea of frame and fill to create a bounded presence, with these larger patterns from the exterior, I let myself experiment with the idea of a section or a fragment of a larger whole. And I also experimented with the idea of using similar pattern information over a range of projects, from painting to sound installation to music production. At this time, I had been playing music in bands in Los Angeles for roughly 10 years and had been recently involved in making music that was more blatantly inspired by pop. So in a rather ham-fisted move, I decided to pair the rock patterns of the freeway walls with sentimental pop song covers about rocks. This project was a listening room in which the visitor entered from the street into this sort of cool, quiet space and was invited to play a two-sided record. And there were sort of two sides of curtains, one side that featured this sort of dark gray pattern on the light gray fabric, and the other a metallic gold pattern on a sort of deep gray fabric. And they were made as sort of heavy-duty sound curtains that were meant to provide a kind of optimum listening experience, but they were also meant to provide visual context. And I produced a limited edition LP on which I sang covers of Solid as a Rock by Ashford and Simpson and Landslide by Stevie Nicks. So I was thinking of the messy romantic narratives implied by these songs and the way that each tells stories about patterns of solidity or entropy, much like the structural relationships that I noticed in the endlessly crumbling and rebuilt freeway walls of Los Angeles. I worked with Maggie White Lomelli, who was a former student who's gone on to start her own edition studio, to handprint the curtains on large sections of heavy linen. And then we sewed them together to make the panels that flanked the room. And this is Nam Lin, another former student and an expert seamstress. And this project led to at least one more iteration of the pattern, a wall painting for a group show in LA's Chinatown. As you saw earlier, I had been experimenting with wall painting in my studio, and I was eager to try a larger piece, so I proposed a wall painting that functioned as wallpaper for the show. This is an image of two students of mine from UC Riverside who helped me install the piece, and this is the method that I still use in applying pattern to walls. I make sort of large-scale paper templates that are backed with carbon or sometimes kind of wax drawing material or pastel, and then we trace the image onto the wall. So basically you end up with a kind of large template drawing that covers the entire wall. And the painting's made in layers, applied with sponges and brushes, and this image shows the underpainting, which is more gestural, which is the kind of more gray, brushy area of the painting, and then the partially completed line work, which is more precise. And then this is the finished piece. And then this is what it looked like in the context of the show, with pieces by Jill Newman and Pat O'Neill installed on top of it. So for me, this piece brought my fascination with the rock patterns full circle, because the initial cement patch pattern that I showed you at the beginning, that I said was an original composition, was just 2 blocks from this space. So I felt like I had sort of come back to the site. So painting can be wonderfully absorptive for the painter, but it can also be a lonely business. At this time, I not only wanted to engage the world outside of the studio, but I wanted to work with other people who had different skill sets. By choosing a limited set of patterns and exploring them through a number of different media and interactions, I felt that I was gradually opening up my process to new possibilities. Rather than thinking of the limited intentional surface of the painting as a source of presence, I began to think about larger sensory implications. Perhaps a pattern could be a context-changing backdrop for articulating new relationships between multiple artworks, or perhaps a pattern could produce an atmosphere or communicate a sense of place. I'm going to shift gears geographically here, but continue the discussion about wall painting. In 2011, I moved from Los Angeles to upstate New York and was enthralled with a new language of vernacular architecture, new kinds of patterns and materials that I hadn't seen before, or that I at least was not as familiar with. As usual, I was particularly interested in pattern and began to notice the ubiquity of a material called ranch stone. Ranch stone is a compressed asphalt shingle material, and it's often used as a protective facing on damaged clapboard construction. And it comes in a variety of colors and scale combinations. And I like to think of it as a strange kind of inside-out interpretation of wallpaper, as though the decorative patterning we most often associate with the interior has been externalized somehow. At the same time, I was invited to make a piece at the University Museum at Albany. And this university was designed by Edward Durrell Stone and is a master-planned campus with a very striking mid-century architectural layout. In particular, these sort of long colonnades that border a central fountain and a bell tower. I knew that I wanted to address the columns in the museum space as well. And an additional problem-solving curiosity of mine was, what will happen if a painting wraps a 3D object? In the past, I had applied the pattern onto flat walls, so this was a new experiment. Ranch stone seemed like the perfect pattern for this experiment since it was used to wrap dimensional structures and it had historical significance. The production of ranch stone, which was roughly 1930 to 1970, corresponds with the heyday of mid-century modernist design, of which this campus is a product. And it also corresponds with the early modernist ideal of designing inexpensive, efficient products for the general population. I liked the idea of grafting the image of this inexpensive common building material onto the elegant columns of Edward Durrellstone's International Modernist Museum. I was also interested in the layers of facsimile implied by the materials. Ranch stone is already simulated stonework, replacing an expensive structural solution with a thrifty surface. In this piece, I hoped that I was reinscribing the structural purpose of the columns through an indication of material and labor, almost as though I was returning this kind of elegant, invisible white column back to bricks and mortar. And I was also celebrating the ability of painting to transform structure through surface manipulation. After making a few site-specific paintings, I had an opportunity for an upcoming gallery show, and I wanted to see if I could combine this interest in wall painting with my other more portable painting practice. I continued to draw upon my surroundings, and I combined 2 photo archives related to the idea of abandoned domestic space. One group of images recorded boarded up, empty residential spaces in and around my current hometown of Troy, New York. I was thinking especially about all the different materials that people were using to block a window. In this case, it's sort of bits and pieces of stone and fragments of countertop, or fake bricks inside of real bricks. And then the second group of photos were images of my grandparents' former South Florida home. In the case of both the houses in Troy and my grandparents' house, I was interested in the idea that the homes existed only in memory or photography, since they were either uninhabited or no longer inhabited by the original family. So I used the patterns and imagery from the houses in Troy and the palette from the photographs in my grandparents' home, which is incidentally the only palette I've ever made using printed photos, all of which were pre-digital. So this is the exhibition that came out of that combination. The show itself was called A Wall Around a Window, and you would sort of enter into the gallery and encounter a series of wall paintings and paintings in combination with each other. So I thought of this view as being similar to encountering a building from the exterior, in which the paintings function as kind of boarded up windows. The wall painting itself, which is maybe a little hard to see because it's rather delicate, was based on cement block construction. And using architectural details as a springboard, I wanted to make paintings that sort of nodded at this idea of illusion, like as though perhaps they could be a boarded up window, but remained very flat. I was thinking about this idea of like, how can you show that the material is only surface deep while still playing with the illusion of materiality or physicality in some way? And this is just a detail to show kind of the relationship of where the painting hits the wall. So the paintings themselves are fairly graphic and are made with acrylic paint on linen, but then the wall paintings are made with this very watery, almost watercolory kind of application. And as you kind of navigated this space, you would encounter another pair of pieces, one of which was a large format, singular screen print on dyed linen. It's more like a textile wall hanging, perhaps, than a traditional print, accompanied by a maple stool that I milled with the help of an expert. And then you can see kind of from the left that the textile piece was installed to mimic sort of the formal qualities of a window shade. And then as you kind of turned around to the rest of the space, you would face a similar pattern, a cement block pattern that had been on the former wall, but now reoriented in a different color combination. And if I had thought of the other wall as kind of an exterior wall, I sort of thought of this wall as being like an interior in some way. And then the window at the end of the room faces the screen printed piece. So that screen printed piece that you saw was basically made to be the same aspect ratio of the window and sort of refers to the pattern of the panes above. So I guess just to go back to that was just to say that I was really like thinking of this as a kind of problem-solving exercise in a way in which I was trying to figure out like how I could transform a space through wall painting, how I could make you feel as though you might be in a different space, but while still using details from the space and kind of tailoring my work to speak to that space in a way as well. So we're getting close to present day. In 2014, I was able to have a research leave, and I spent most of that time in Brazil and Peru. And I spent about 3.5 months in Rio de Janeiro, and I created a series of projects for myself. To contextualize a little bit, the arc of the work that I've shown you today on some simple level moves from interior to exterior, from architecture to landscape, and from solitary painting production to processes that involve more intersection with people and places. In Rio, I had one rule for making new work, which is that I couldn't stay in the studio. I wanted to experience the city and the landscape, and I wanted to place myself in situations where I would have to talk to new people, even though I didn't really speak the language very well. So I started by making a palette of objects and paint chips gathered on long walks throughout the city. And this is an image of kind of outdoor studio space that I was lining things up in. And I started multiple projects, some of which are still ongoing. The main project was to record the security grates of the city. In Rio, partly due to the dramatic crime waves of the 80s and 90s, every private space in the city is gated, nearly without exception. Of course, I was initially drawn in by the multiplicity of patterns and colors, but I also recognized that this decorative patterned material defined a border between inside and outside. Usually you could see through this patterned barrier to the other side, but you couldn't physically access it. Often multiple layers of gates and grates created to me a sort of impression of a really carefully decorated prison. So I started by making rubbings of patterns as a record of scale, thinking that I might want to use them in future wall paintings. And I was making some fast watercolor experiments with the patterns, trying to figure out what to do with them. And during the last month there, I made a wall painting in my neighborhood just down the street from my front door. I'm going to explain this painting just a little bit. In this case, I was kind of repainting something that had been removed. So on the right-hand side is this kind of terracotta tiling that is covering an existing window, and it basically produces a kind of privacy and shade screen for the folks who live inside. And they had removed a window next to it that had been sort of plastered over, but was very, very evident. The absent window was very evident. So I ended up making this piece where I kind of put the window back, but just in a painted form. And I was thinking about the idea of making an aperture in a building through the simple act of painting or opening up a space as though it could be a possible antidote to the walled-off private spaces of the city. And then when I returned to the States, I started playing more with this idea of inside and outside, sometimes actually fabricating new decorative grates or using paint to draw attention to existing security structures, or making wall paintings that used the patterns that I had gathered. But eventually I found myself back in the studio working out ideas on small-scale paintings and watercolors, trying to figure out how to use this imagery and trying to figure out what form would make sense. I decided to isolate the pattern grates and to emphasize the dimensionality of the object. I wanted to show that the decorative grate was in fact a hard physical barrier, but I was trying to figure out a way to visually subvert its intended use, which is to keep others out. The use of isometric perspective may seem like a small detail, but it was a move away from the resolutely flat method of my previous paintings. In this case, it was a carefully calculated way of indicating spatial illusion while still maintaining an aspect of flatness. As a side note, isometric perspective, which of course is different than traditional linear perspective, was often used in early video game rendering or in sci-fi illustration. I think partly because it both alludes to dimensional reality, but acknowledges the fact that it's a fictitious construction. It's sort of telling you that there's real space, but it doesn't actually correspond to a logical space. So I tried multiple versions of this image and remained unsatisfied until I cut it out. And I'm showing you something about my process here to acknowledge the level of minutia that I consider in formal painterly decisions and the ways that I attribute meaning to those forms. In this case, I'm slowly working my way through a patterned image to find a way that I can transform it from being a picture to something that could possibly be a presence. Hopefully, this cutout form now hints at the idea of standing on its own 2 feet, hands on hips and elbows, facing off with the viewer. Since it's an image that originates from home security, I'd like someone to initially feel visually or physically blocked by its presence. But I also want to undermine the power relationship implied by that simple image. While removing the form from its rectangle and placing it in space empowers it as a symbol of strength and security, it also subverts its intactness, since every edge and border is now unsecured. Additionally, while the diamond patterned grate flatly blocks our ability to enter the deep space of the painting, its awkward perspective implies that we actually see it from the side, which would indicate an opening or an ability to traverse behind the screen. Finally, the decision to paint these grates in watercolor was a deliberate attempt to undermine the material strength of the original object by rendering it in a delicate painterly material. So there was a rationale to these watercolors. They couldn't be a closed form. They had to be close to life size. They had to use the palette from Rio. They used isometric perspective. They used watercolor. And in this regard, I think my working process can sometimes be similar to that of a designer, like coming up with a prototype and tweaking it until it performs as expected, and then manifesting that prototype in several iterations. This level of intentionality is also perhaps important because of the decorative nature of my visual references. I use decorative source material for its connections to gender or history or memory, but I don't want to make decorative pictures. Instead, I want to make contemplative images that actively engage the viewer in a dialogue, asking for their reconsideration of the seemingly innocuous. This is especially important in the context of talking about pattern. I'm going to return to Gombrich for just a moment, the author I mentioned earlier. In The Sense of Order, he talks about the hierarchical relationship between different levels of observation: seeing, looking, attending, and reading. Seeing being the lowest or most cursory function, and reading being the most engaged thinking category of observation. And just to clarify, he means reading images, not necessarily the act of reading a book. In the decorative arts, a concentrated visual reading is not immediately expected because our experience and cultural conditioning tell us that a repeating pattern can be quickly scanned rather than interrogated with optical intensity. We assume a certain degree of order and don't usually interrogate the patterned surface even as we visually absorb it. This, I think, suggests a really interesting role for pattern and for the decorative, in which undercalculated information can be continually absorbed by an unsuspecting viewer. So, jumping forward just a bit, I began employing some of the spatial perspective and technique from the last body of work towards paintings and drawings made in response to visual information from my immediate surroundings. And I'm sort of, skipping some work that came between these two things, but I think they're related. Gathering details from vernacular architecture and local crafts in my area, I tried to work through the idea of creating a strongly present, dimensionally embodied figure in pattern. And this is a detail to get an idea of the painting surface, since I don't think they always translate super well digitally. These paintings were made from a palette derived from observation in the Catskill Mountains and refer to different seasonal shifts in light and color. While I wanted the intimacy and slow looking process afforded by a smaller canvas, these are not very large. We're seeing them, wow, they're much larger than they are in real life. Really, in reality, they're about 29 by 23, so not a terribly big painting. I still wanted the immersive experience of the larger scale wall painting, even though I was making these smaller paintings. So I thought of the wall painting as a sort of atmosphere or temperature that could provide context for encountering the smaller, more insistent presence of the paintings. Some of you may have seen this work when it was shown last spring here in Denver at the Museum of Contemporary Art. And this is a magically digitally spliced documentation of that installation. And this is the last image that I'll show. But so in some ways in this work, I was sort of trying to bring together these two different ways of working that I had been experimenting with, trying to use pattern in at least two different ways, so that on the one hand, I'm sort of trying to take pattern out of its context and turn it almost into a figure that's facing off with you in the small paintings. But then on the other hand, in the larger wall painting, I really am using the pattern almost as yardage, using it to create context for viewing the smaller pieces with a degree of close observation, close reading. And so kind of playing, the reason I brought up that idea of the hierarchy of different ways of seeing from Gombrich is thinking of this idea of like, oh, what am I doing right now? Am I scanning or am I focusing? And how might those two different activities inform each other when they're in close proximity? So I just want to close by saying that since I'm here at a school, I like to say that to make art is an intentional act, one that includes a point of view, a unique subjectivity, and a generative gesture, making something in the world that didn't exist. To go back to Agnes Martin, Agnes Martin said that to be an artist is to be discontent. The very act of making a new model or a new artwork suggests that you find the existing models inadequate. And that's how I see painting, as a proposal or model for looking, and by extension, for experiencing. In the way that one paints, in the scale and materials chosen, in the imagery selected, the painter describes a possible model to the viewer. Since the way we visually navigate the world informs so much of our lived experience, the attempt to influence the viewer's perceptual experience can have radical implications. The end.
Hi.
Hi.
It seems like scale is really important to your work, and one of the things that I was struck by at the piece at the MCA was where it was installed. That sort of yardage of pattern, I couldn't get away from it enough to see it, so I was really forced to look at the smaller works, and it seems like you're really interested in the body's relationship to how we're seeing the work and the way that you're manipulating the viewer into how they're engaging with the work. So I'm wondering how you consider the sort of viewer, the human body, in relationship to the work.
Yeah, I mean, a lot. I think about that every time I'm making something. And also when I mentioned earlier that I feel like I sometimes function, I'm going to try to get out of this, oh, that's so much better, spotlight that's blinding me. Often I'll sort of work through a series and think about a specific physical or scale relationship that I'm trying to figure out. And so I mentioned with that other body of work that, I came to certain decisions and then would make several of them, almost like you're making a prototype and moving forward. And for the paintings for the show that was at the MCA, I knew a little bit about the depth of space that was available, and I knew that you couldn't get back really far from the wall. And I also, even before that, knew that I wanted something that you would look at closely. Those paintings, sometimes I think, as an artist, you might be trying to give someone, or trying to provide an experience that the painting was derived from. So for me, the initial experience that propelled me to make those paintings, they were all visual experiences in nature that were about close looking, like looking at, in really great detail, the colors and patterns made by a fiddlehead fern as it's like just coming out of the earth or something, or thinking about the way that light filters through trees if you're under like a really tall grove of pines, which is what the wall painting was derived from. So I was really thinking about like, how could I make an environment where you slow down and look carefully? And one way to do that, I think, is through scale. When you make small paintings that only one person can really look at a time, you're kind of asking for a more intimate, one-on-one kind of slow-looking experience, or you're hoping for that maybe, I don't know. And so a lot of that is also just trial and error. Like when I'm starting a new series of paintings, I'll make these sort of paper templates of different sizes, and there will often be like 10 templates that are all just like an inch different from each other, and just like, looking at them in my studio and seeing like, okay, that's a big enough size that it takes up my field of vision, but I still see the edges? Or do I want something that takes up my peripheral vision? Or, thinking about those kinds of calculations carefully in the beginning of the making process is really important to me, for sure. Yeah, and then I just kind of got lucky with that wall. I was initially supposed to be on a much smaller wall, and then there became like some installation issues. Like, nobody wants like a giant wall painting being made next to the Georgia O'Keeffe painting. Like, that's a bad logistical idea. So I ended up in that space, and I had never made a wall painting that large, just in terms of square footage, and so it afforded me the opportunity to try some new things in terms of scale.
I am going to try to articulate this question in a way that's beneficial for my students. I am a professor of a class that is focused on helping students learn how to ideate. And when you talk about having a residency in Brazil, for example, I could feel like there's a lot of pressure in that kind of project. Like maybe there's like, oh, what am I going to do with this? How am I going to make the most out of this experience? And I feel like students also feel that concern about like how I'm going to, solve this problem best. And I'm wondering if you could give students any advice as to how they can ideate through when they're given those kind of opportunities, how they can practice a way to make the most out of that experience and to get rid of some of the stress.
One of the processes that I talked about a little bit here is this sort of color matching process that I do. So for me, having a point, it doesn't matter what point that this is. I mean, I think for students, it could be any system you devise for yourself, but having some point that allows you to start a project before you know what you're going to do with it, So for instance, when I started making those color palettes, I didn't know what I was going to use them for. It was partly because I was at this residency in Santa Fe, and I didn't really know what I was doing, and I mostly just wanted to go hang out up at the biotexture site in Taos and like help them build buildings with tires and beer cans and stuff. So, but I knew that I wanted to make something. And so for me, having some kind of really practical task that I engage with as a way to start is the key. And so, by the time I've made 20 or 25 colors, I'm starting to think through something, like ideas are starting to kind of bubble up. And then the same thing I would say for some of these projects, I'm also collecting pattern. So whether that's through photography or doing rubbings or something, it's like, again, providing myself with a really pragmatic framework for gathering information. And then it just seems inevitable. Like you start having all this information and the bits and pieces start talking to each other and then things kind of start happening. I mean, it's also okay to sometimes things don't happen too. It's okay to allow that, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, love these things. Okay, so I have more of a question on your process with the wall painting. So I kind of deal with, in my own work, working on a smaller scale, but now when I'm doing like mass productions or something that's larger, we have this opportunity now to deal with technology of printing or doing, having technology take over that aspect. So I just wanted to know what your take is on it, and are you still hand painting these, and why?
Yeah.
not as like a bad thing, but like
why? No, yeah.
There's just so many. I mean,
yeah,
all
of
these
course.
students are so lucky in so many ways now because technology is there's so many opportunities.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear your opinion on why.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I mean, certainly it's something I've heard a lot, and also, there are so many ways in which you can take something small scale and scale it up or make a kind of architectural version of it through different kinds of technological means. And I think all of those things are super cool, and I don't have any kind of purist relationship to technology in any way. I'm also, as you saw, not that great at operating it, so that's a little bit of a barrier. But, I am interested in this idea of, for me, and this is partly just based on my own experience in the world. I mean, I feel very distracted by all of the things that technology affords me. And I'm really interested in this idea of what's it like to have a slower visual experience, or, that's why I use the word contemplative a few different times. Like, what's it like to have a slow seeing thinking experience, this like sort of deep observation. Pauline Oliveros, the fantastic musician and composer, had a course in deep listening, and I keep thinking, oh, there should be a class in like deep looking, you know, like what does it mean to really look at something fully and carefully. So I do think in some ways that artists have the power to use aspects of the handmade to kind of engage a viewer in that process of slow looking. It's not the only way. I don't think you can't do it with technology. I'm sure there's a way. I just don't personally know how. But I feel like there can be almost a kind of a mirroring experience. Like someone sees, you know, this giant pattern, and then they get closer and they're like, oh my gosh, that was handmade. This person was here for a really long time. And then there's kind of like evidence of the body and time passing and this different kind of physical relationship. And then maybe, hopefully, there's this kind of recognition by the viewer of their physical experience or their body or their temporal experience. And hopefully other kinds of ideas can start to come up then. So that's why I'm making things by hand, but I think there are lots of other ways to do that use technology for sure. Yeah. Hopefully you'll figure them out. Yeah.
In the process.
Yeah.
So I'm working on a project right now that explores the spiritual experience of interacting with visual art, and we are intentionally defining that very broadly. There's not a particular stream of spirituality. Just curious about that human experience of something that is beyond ourselves. And I just wonder if you think about that in your process and what that looks like for you.
A lot of the work I've made over the last, I would say, 3 or 4 years, of which this work is like a kind of small snippet, is based on these experiences in nature, which, you know, I don't know if I would call them spiritual. Maybe they are. I definitely see them as sort of metaphysical on some level, where maybe I'm experiencing something that is about a quality of light or a kind of atmosphere or an uncanny kind of experience that I can't really explain in some way. And I mean, to me, that's like at the heart of a lot of these visual interests and the interest in trying to replicate them or reference them in some way. So yeah, I think that it's an internal aspect of my work that I haven't really forced myself to explain, but now that you've brought it up, I will probably think about it more. Yeah.
My question is, you talked about in your earlier works their connection to different feminist ideas, and I was wondering if you could talk about in your more recent work how that connects to that, or if it does at all.
I think in that earlier work, there was really such a one-to-one comparison. It's like, here's an Afghan that this anonymous crafter made, and it got left in a thrift store somewhere, and I'm gonna, pull it out of the bin and make this kind of very meticulous portrait of it. Like, it felt like an act of like trying to valorize something, which it felt feminist to me in that regard. Not because I think all Afghans are made by women or that that's even important. That sounds very essentialist, but just in the context of the larger visual vocabulary, like these were objects that seemed to continually get attributed to ideas of like women's work or something. So now the visual references that I'm using are a lot more hybridized. So for instance, maybe if I go back just a couple, this pattern is taken from a shaker chair weaving pattern. And again, it's referring back to this idea of a kind of quiet, maybe almost unrecognized craft that gets built into kind of daily utility. And I'm taking it, and instead of thinking about it as a flat surface that is, sat on and used and not necessarily remarked upon, it's like taking it and making it vertical, again, thinking about this idea of almost a kind of portrait or a presence of some sort, and then by making it volumetric, I think I'm trying to describe the idea that it's almost like a character, or it almost has this kind of animating presence. So I think, part of what I'm thinking about is the idea of agency. It's like taking something that was maybe like a discarded object or even just a flat object of use, and that it's suddenly like springing to life and having its own power in some way. I know that sounds kind of like magical thinking, but yeah, that's my line of thinking about it. Does that make sense? Yeah, definitely. Okay.
Let's give it up for Melissa, everybody. Thank you so much.